Story number 1. Phantom Reel. The Orpheum Theater had been a part of downtown Seattle for almost a century, a grand old lady of the silver screen. The red brick facade with its gilded marquee screamed nostalgia. But behind its ornate doors lay a darker history, one the locals only whispered about. The fire of 1978 was the turning point. That night, 43 people perished in Theater 3, trapped by locked exit doors and choking smoke. The city mourned, lawsuits followed, and the Orpheum teetered on the edge of ruin. But like most things in America, tragedy was soon buried beneath fresh paint and a PR campaign. Theater 3 reopened, polished and modernized, while the memories of those lost faded into urban legend. I was the night manager, a title that sounded more important than it was. My duties revolved around late-night ticket sales, grumbling at teenagers sneaking into R-rated movies, and making sure the popcorn machine didn't explode. But the Orpheum had a peculiar habit of making me feel like I wasn't alone, even when I was locking up past midnight. It started as whispers. At first, I chalked it up to the building's quirks, drafty corridors, and creaky air vents. But then came the ticket discrepancies. Theater 3 was the smallest room in the Orpheum, with exactly 50 seats. Yet the sales reports regularly showed 55, 60, sometimes 70 tickets sold for a single screening. Probably a glitch, Lyle from IT muttered, not looking up from his laptop as he ran diagnostics. The system's old. I'll patch it. The numbers didn't stop climbing, and neither did my unease. I began noticing other strange occurrences. Security footage showed figures moving in Theater 3 long after the last show ended. Faint shapes, barely more than shadows, sitting motionless in the seats. I asked the cleaning staff if they'd noticed anything unusual, but they just gave me wary looks and changed the subject. One Friday night, I decided to investigate. Theater 3 was screening The Shining, and it felt grimly appropriate. I stood at the back of the room as the movie played, clipboard in hand, counting heads. 50 people, all accounted for. But as the lights dimmed and the iconic opening score began, I saw them. At first, they were just faint outlines, like smudges on a window pane. But as the film flickered on, they grew sharper. Gray, semi-transparent figures filled the empty seats, their faces turned toward the screen in unblinking attention. I leaned down to the nearest patron, a middle-aged man chewing on a bucket of popcorn. "Hey, do you see that?" "See what?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the screen. I pointed to the seat beside him, where a woman's shadowy figure was perched, hands folded neatly in her lap. "That?" The man frowned. "Buddy, the seat's empty." I stared. The shadow didn't move, didn't react to my voice. It just sat there, watching the movie. The security footage confirmed my worst fears. Rewinding the tape, I saw the shadows entering Theater 3, one by one, slipping into seats as if drawn by the glow of the projector. They didn't interact with anyone. They didn't move. They were just there. "Looks like a trick of the light," Riley, my assistant, said when I showed her the footage. She sounded more hopeful than convinced. "It's not a trick," I replied. She hesitated. "You think it's them?" "Who?" "The ones who died in the fire." I wanted to laugh it off, but the theory stuck in my mind like a splinter. The fire of 78 was no secret. Faulty wiring and negligent owners had turned Theater 3 into a death trap. And now, decades later, it felt like the dead were still holding their seats. The whispers grew louder in the weeks that followed. Patrons began complaining about strange noises, soft, unintelligible murmurs during screenings. Others reported cold drafts, even though the heating system was fully operational. One couple fled Theater 3 halfway through a showing of Poltergeist, pale and shaking. "There's something wrong in there," the woman gasped. Her boyfriend nodded. We felt hands on us. Cold hands. But when we turned around, no one was there. I started digging into the Orpheum's history, poring over archives and old newspapers. The fire wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal. The owners had ignored multiple safety violations, including reports of faulty wiring and blocked exits. When the blaze broke out, there was no escape. One article stood out, a grainy black and white photo of the aftermath. The caption read, "Theater 3 reduced to ash and rubble. Investigators search for remains." The image chilled me. I recognized the layout of the room. It hadn't just been rebuilt, it had been rebuilt directly over the ashes. By December, the activity reached a fever pitch. I would find seats in Theater 3 inexplicably warm, as if someone had just been sitting there. Shadows lingered even before the lights dimmed, their forms sharper, more defined. One night, after the last show ended, I stayed behind to confront whatever haunted the theater. Armed with a flashlight and a shaky resolve, I stepped into Theater 3. The air was heavy, oppressive. "Is anyone here?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, gravelly voice whispered from the projection booth. "You shouldn't be here." I whipped my flashlight toward the sound, but the booth was empty. The voice came again, closer this time. "Leave." The door behind me slammed shut. My flashlight flickered, and the projector roared to life on its own. On the screen, black and white footage played. It wasn't the night's feature film. It was a reel of the fire. The images were horrific, patrons clawing at locked doors, smoke billowing as flames engulfed the room. Their screams filled the theater, raw and desperate. And then the shadows turned. They stared directly at me, hollow eyes burning with anger. One by one, they pointed. The projector stopped. The theater plunged into darkness. I left the Orpheum that night and never went back. The theater closed its doors soon after, officially citing financial difficulties. But I knew better. Some tragedies don't fade with time. They linger, like ghosts in the walls, waiting for an audience. And somewhere in the silence of Theater 3, the shadows are still watching, waiting for their next show. Story number 2. The 13th Viewer. The Rialto Theater was a relic of another time, standing at the edge of our sleepy New England town like a monument to the past. Its Art Deco facade and flickering neon sign were charming in the way old buildings often are, beautiful in daylight but shadowed by a creeping unease after dark. I had been working there for 3 years, part-time while finishing my last stretch of college. The job wasn't glamorous, selling popcorn, cleaning up soda spills, and shooing away kids trying to sneak into R-rated movies. But it was easy, and I liked the old place. It had character, even if that character came with creaky floors and an inexplicable draft that made you shiver no matter how high the heat was turned up. In the fall of that year, the Rialto's owner, Mr. Carpenter, decided to hold a month-long classic film festival. The idea was to draw on older crowds nostalgic for movies they'd seen in their youth. The lineup included Casablanca, Psycho, and The Exorcist. Then came the night of Vertigo. The first thing I noticed was the head count. Theater 1, where we were showing the film, had 80 seats. All were sold out. I'd counted the tickets myself at the box office. But when I stepped inside to do a final check before the movie began, I saw something strange. There were 81 people. It didn't register at first. I scanned the room twice, then a third time, counting under my breath. The rows were packed tight, and one seat in the back corner stood out. A man sat there, dressed in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Something about him felt wrong. I approached Riley, the usher working that night. Hey, did someone sneak in? We're one over capacity. Riley shrugged. Doesn't seem likely. I've been at the door all night. I nodded, though unease prickled at the back of my neck. Maybe I miscounted. Maybe I was just tired. The movie started, and the room plunged into darkness. By the time the credits rolled, most of the audience had filtered out, chatting about Hitchcock's genius as they headed for the exits. I went back into Theater 1 to start cleaning up and froze. The seat in the back corner, the one where the strange man had been sitting, was empty. Blood pooled in the fabric, dripping onto the floor. It wasn't much, but it was unmistakable. Riley! I called, my voice cracking. She appeared in the doorway, mop in hand. What's wrong? I pointed to the seat, but when she saw it, she frowned. What are you talking about? There's nothing there. I turned back. The blood was gone. The following night, we showed The Exorcist. Again, Theater 1 sold out. Again, I counted 80 tickets but 81 heads. The extra was always the same man, back row, same corner, same shadowed face. This time, I watched him. Through the flicker of the projector's light, I could see his body was unnaturally still. He didn't flinch at the shocking scenes, didn't laugh when others did. He was more like a statue than a person. When the movie ended, I lingered near the exit, waiting to see him leave. But as the crowd thinned, he was gone. And when I checked his seat, it was covered in blood again. The pattern continued for weeks. Every classic film, every packed house. The 13th viewer, as I began to call him, was always there, always vanishing before the lights came up. I finally told Mr. Carpenter. He listened with an amused smile, but I could tell he didn't believe me. A ghost? Come on, kid. It's probably just some prankster messing with you. But it wasn't. The turning point came on Halloween, when we showed Psycho. The Rialto was packed to the rafters, and the air felt charged, like a storm brewing. I watched the audience carefully that night, my eyes darting to the back corner every few minutes. Halfway through the shower scene, I saw him stand up. The movement was so sudden it made me jump. The audience didn't react, they were too engrossed in the film. But the 13th viewer turned slowly, his face still hidden by shadows, and looked directly at me. I couldn't move. His eyes, or where his eyes should have been, were black, empty voids. He raised a hand and pointed. Not at the screen, not at the exit. At me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of that pointed finger haunted me. It felt like an accusation, a warning. I decided to dig into the Rialto's history, something I probably should have done long before. The local library's archives were sparse, but I found an article from 1957 that made my blood run cold. A murder had taken place in Theater 1. The victim was a man named Charles Hargrove, a drifter who had been stabbed during a late-night screening. Witnesses said he was sitting in the back corner when the attack happened. The killer was never caught, and the motive remained a mystery. The final film in the festival was Casablanca. By then, I was convinced the 13th viewer was Hargrove, a restless spirit tied to the place of his death. But I didn't understand why he kept appearing, or why he seemed to be growing bolder. That night, the Rialto was packed to capacity. I stood near the back, clutching a flashlight, determined to confront him. As the film played, I felt the air shift. The temperature dropped, and the theater grew eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the projector. When I glanced at the back corner, he wasn't there. He was standing in the aisle. The audience didn't notice. They were frozen, transfixed by the screen as if held in a trance. The 13th viewer moved closer, his footsteps silent, his hollow eyes locked on me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. When he was just a few feet away, he reached out a hand. His voice was barely a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. "Your turn." The lights flickered, and the screen went dark. When I woke up, the theater was empty. My clothes were soaked with sweat, or was it blood? The back corner seat was clean, but I knew what I had seen. I quit the next day, leaving the Rialto and its ghostly guest behind. But sometimes, when I drive past the old theater, I see the marquee flicker. And in the shadows of Theater 1, I swear there's still someone sitting in the back row, waiting for the next show to begin. Story number 3. The Killing Screen. The Rialto Cinema was a relic of another time, an old-world theater clawing for relevance in the age of megaplexes and streaming services. Its crown jewel had always been its screen in Theater 5, a cavernous room with enough ornate trim and velvet seats to make you forget the sticky floors. But after years of struggling ticket sales and dwindling attendance, the owners decided it was time for a change. That's when they brought in the screen. I didn't think much of it at first. As the assistant manager, I'd been privy to every harebrained scheme designed to save the Rialto, from midnight horror marathons to weekly trivia nights. But this screen? It was different. Mr. Hargrove, the theater's owner, was unusually tight-lipped about its origins, saying only that it was a custom import from overseas. It arrived in a massive crate, smelling faintly of leather and something else, something I couldn't place, but that made my stomach turn. The installation team worked overnight to replace the old screen, and by the next morning, Theater 5 was ready to unveil its new centerpiece. It's state-of-the-art, Hargrove boasted to the staff. Picture quality's so real, it's like you're part of the movie. That's exactly what terrified me. The first show with the new screen was a free preview night for VIPs, local press, influencers, and a few longtime patrons. I was working the lobby, overseeing concessions, but the buzz was palpable. The crowd was excited, leaning into Hargrove's hype as they filed into Theater 5 to watch a remastered cut of Citizen Kane. Everything seemed fine at first. But 15 minutes into the film, the screaming started. I ran toward the theater, my sneakers squeaking against the tile as I threw open the heavy doors. Inside, the room was chaos. People scrambled out of their seats, knocking over popcorn and spilling drinks as they rushed for the exit. "What's going on?" I yelled over the commotion. No one stopped to answer. They just pushed past me, wide-eyed and pale, mumbling about something on the screen. The theater was empty within minutes, save for one man, a middle-aged journalist named Peter who sat frozen in his seat, staring at the screen with a look of abject horror. "Peter?" I called, stepping closer. He didn't move. On the screen, the scene from Citizen Kane had been replaced by something I couldn't explain. It was Peter. Not just a likeness of him, but an exact replica, down to the pinstripe blazer and thinning hair. He was sitting in the same seat, in the same room, but his on-screen doppelganger was screaming. Blood poured from his chest as an unseen blade plunged into him again and again. I turned to Peter, my voice trembling. "We need to go." But before I could reach him, he collapsed forward, clutching his chest. Blood spilled onto the sticky theater floor, pooling beneath his chair. The Rialto shut down for a week after that night. Hargrove called it a temporary closure for technical upgrades, but the staff knew better. Peter's death was ruled a heart attack, but none of us believed it. Not after what we saw. Hargrove should have gotten rid of the screen then and there, but he refused. "It's a freak incident," he said, brushing off our concerns. "We can't scrap a $200,000 investment over a coincidence." But it wasn't a coincidence. When the Rialto reopened, the screen in Theater 5 became a magnet for curiosity seekers. Word of Peter's death, and the rumors about what people saw on the screen, spread like wildfire. Tickets sold out for weeks, with thrill seekers eager to see if the haunted screen would show them something. It did. I started noticing the same pattern. During every screening, at least one person would react strangely, going pale and whispering frantically to those around them. Some bolted for the exit. Others stayed, mesmerized by whatever the screen was showing them. And always, without fail, the vision came true. One woman, a local baker named June, saw herself pinned beneath a car, screaming for help as flames engulfed her. The next morning, she was killed in a freak accident when a delivery truck jumped the curb. A teenage boy named Kyle saw himself drowning, his face turning blue as unseen hands pulled him underwater. He was found dead in his bathtub 3 days later. Every victim had one thing in common: their deaths were shown on the screen before they happened. I became obsessed with the screen, trying to understand its origins. Late at night, after the last show ended, I would sit in Theater 5 and stare at it, daring it to show me something. But it never did. Not until the night I finally worked up the courage to confront Hargrove. He was in his office, nursing a tumbler of whiskey and flipping through invoices when I burst in. "You need to tell me where that screen came from," I demanded. Hargrove looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. "It's just a screen." "Bullshit," I snapped. "People are dying, and you know it. What's it made of? Why does it do this?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's custom." "From where?" "Romania," he admitted reluctantly. "A man approached me at a trade show in Bucharest. Said his screens were unlike anything else in the world." "What's it made of?" I pressed. Hargrove hesitated, then muttered something under his breath. "What?" "Skin," he said louder, his voice breaking. "Human skin." The screen wasn't just a projection surface. It was alive. Each death it showed wasn't just a vision, it was a harvest. The souls of its victims were trapped within it, their final moments replayed in an endless loop of agony. I quit the next day. But the screen wouldn't let me go. A week after I left the Rialto, I started seeing things. Reflections in mirrors that weren't my own. Flickers of movement in the corner of my eye. And then, one night, I woke to find my bedroom bathed in the cold glow of a projector. On the wall opposite my bed, an image played. It was me. I was sitting in my room, just as I was now. But in the vision, I wasn't alone. A shadow moved behind me, long fingers stretching toward my neck. I turned, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the wall, the image had changed. My lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, my face twisted in terror. I don't have much time. The screen is still out there, waiting for its next audience. If you ever see it, run. Don't look back. Because once you see your death, there's no escaping it. Story number 4. Midnight Matinee. The Orpheum Theater wasn't the kind of place you went if you wanted state-of-the-art sound systems or reclining seats. It was old, ancient by local standards, and looked like it had been pulled straight out of a 1950s horror flick. Faded red carpet, a popcorn machine that squealed like it was dying, and a faint smell of mildew that no amount of Febreze could kill. That night, the Orpheum was hosting a midnight showing of Blood Harvest, a cult horror classic. My friends and I had heard about it through a flyer tacked to the bulletin board at our favorite coffee shop. One night only, it said. Midnight Matinee. Experience the film like never before. I should have known something was off when we got to the box office. The ticket seller was an old man with clouded eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He stared at each of us as he handed over our tickets, his hand lingering just a little too long. "Enjoy the show," he said, his voice low and gravelly. There were 5 of us, me, Riley, Marcus, Jules, and Kat. We were all horror buffs, The kind of people who watched The Exorcist with the lights off and laughed at the jump scares. But as we stepped into the dimly lit lobby, even Marcus, the self-proclaimed skeptic, looked uneasy. The theater was nearly empty, which wasn't surprising given how niche Blood Harvest was. Aside from us, there were maybe 10 other people scattered throughout the seats. The screen loomed large and blank, the faint hum of the projector the only sound. We sat near the middle, close enough to feel the rumble of the speakers, but far enough back to avoid the next strain. Riley, always the jokester, leaned over and whispered, "Think they'll give us refunds if we died of boredom?" I elbowed him, laughing, but the sound felt hollow in the cavernous space. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. Blood Harvest wasn't a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination. The plot was your typical slasher fare, a group of teenagers trapped in a remote cabin, stalked by a masked killer. The dialogue was cheesy, the effects laughable, but that was part of its charm. At first, everything seemed normal. We whispered jokes to each other, threw popcorn, and laughed at the over-the-top death scenes. But about 20 minutes in, something changed. The screen showed a group of teenagers sitting in a rundown movie theater, much like ours. The room was eerily similar, the same peeling wallpaper, the same sticky floors. "That's creepy," Kat whispered, her eyes narrowing. "What is?" Jules asked. Kat pointed at the screen. "The theater, it looks just like this one." She was right. The details were identical, right down to the crooked exit sign over the door. As the film progressed, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The characters on screen weren't just in a theater like ours, they were us. The girl with short red hair looked exactly like Kat, right down to the worn leather jacket she always wore. The guy cracking jokes about the movie was a dead ringer for Riley. The more we watched, the more we realized we were watching ourselves. "This isn't funny," Marcus said, his voice tight. "No one's laughing," I replied, my throat dry. On screen, the group of teenagers began to notice the same things we were noticing. They argued, tried to leave, but the exits were locked. The screen flickered, and the killer appeared. The first death happened so suddenly that I almost missed it. On screen, the masked figure grabbed the Riley lookalike, dragging him into the shadows. His screams echoed through the theater, loud enough to make my ears ring. Then Riley, the real Riley, gasped. We turned to him just in time to see his face go pale, his hand clutching at his chest. "What's wrong?" Kat asked, reaching for him. But he didn't answer. He slumped forward, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Riley?" Jules knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. He didn't move. The rest of us stared in stunned silence, too afraid to speak. On screen, the killer dragged Riley's body into the shadows, leaving a smear of blood in his wake. The room grew colder, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. "We need to leave," Marcus said, his voice trembling. He bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He threw his weight against it, pounding with his fists. "Let us out," he yelled. The lights flickered, and the screen glitched. For a moment, we saw nothing but static, and then the film resumed. On screen, Marcus was running through the theater, searching for an escape. "Don't," Kat whispered. "Don't move." But it was too late. Marcus stopped pounding on the door, his head snapping toward us as if he'd heard something. Then he was gone. The killer appeared behind him, silent and deliberate. One swift motion, and Marcus was dragged out of sight. Jules screamed, grabbing my arm so tightly it hurt. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." But it was real. The screen flickered again, and we saw ourselves, Jules, Kat, and me, sitting in the exact seats we were in now. The killer was behind us, his shadow stretching across the screen. "We have to stop watching," Kat said, standing abruptly. But the moment she stepped into the aisle, the lights dimmed further, and the screen glitched again. I looked up in time to see Kat on the screen. She was running down the aisle, but the killer was faster. "Kat!" Jules screamed, but she was gone before we could stop her. The screen showed her final moments in vivid detail. It was just Jules and me now. The theater felt impossibly large, the shadows pressing in from every corner. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my body trembling with adrenaline. "We can't let it finish," Jules said, her voice shaking. "If we see the end..." She didn't have to finish. The screen glitched again, showing the two of us. We were standing, staring at the screen, just as we were now. I reached for Jules's hand, gripping it tightly. We're not going to let it win. But the theater had other plans. The projector roared to life, louder and more insistent. The image on screen shifted, and I saw myself alone. Jules was gone. "Jules?" I turned, but she wasn't there. The screen showed her being dragged into the shadows, her screams cutting off abruptly. And then, it was just me. I don't know how long I've been here. The screen won't stop playing, an endless loop of the night I lost my friends. Sometimes I see people walk into the theater, new faces full of curiosity. They don't know what's coming. If you find this, if you hear about the midnight matinee at the Orpheum, don't go. Because once you start the film, it's already too late. Story number 5. The Projectionist's Shadow. They told me the Orpheum Theater had history, but they didn't tell me it had ghosts. I'd been working the projection booth for 3 months when the whispers started. Late-night shifts were quiet, the kind of solitude that made you hear things, air ducts groaning, the occasional pop of an old light bulb. But this was different. The first time it happened, I thought someone was playing a prank. I was threading the projector for the last showing of the night when I heard it, a soft voice, just at the edge of hearing, coming from the reels themselves. "Let us out," it said. I froze, staring at the machine. The room was empty except for me and the ancient equipment, which hummed softly in the dim light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the cramped booth. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Let us out." The Orpheum wasn't just old, it was ancient by movie theater standards. The projection equipment dated back to the 1940s, a relic from the days when film wasn't digital but a tangible, fragile thing. The reels were enormous, the kind of heavy spools that required careful handling. That night, as I threaded the reel, I noticed something strange. The film strip was slick, almost wet, as if it had been dipped in oil. It smelled faintly metallic, like blood. I wiped my hands on my jeans, telling myself it was just old chemicals breaking down. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing night. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more urgent. They came whenever I loaded the reels, a cacophony of voices layered on top of one another, pleading, crying, screaming. And then I started seeing them. It was during the 8 p.m. showing of The Maltese Falcon. I was standing in the booth, watching the film through the tiny window that overlooked the theater. The light from the projector beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the audience in its soft glow. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by a person shifting in their seat. This one moved against the light, darting between the rows like a living thing. I leaned closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The shadow was gone. I convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, an overworked imagination. But the disappearances began shortly after. It started with small things. A coat left draped over a chair, its owner never returning to claim it. A purse sitting abandoned under a seat. At first, I thought they were just cases of forgetfulness. But then, people started vanishing. The first was a man in his 40s, dressed in a business suit. He'd come alone, sitting in the middle of the third row. I remember watching him settle into his seat, his attention glued to the screen as the film began. By the end of the movie, he was gone. At first, I thought he'd slipped out early. But his jacket was still there, neatly folded over the back of his chair. The theater was empty. When I asked the ushers if they'd seen him, they shook their heads. Probably just forgot his coat, one of them said. But I knew better. The disappearances became more frequent. Every week, 1 or 2 people would vanish without a trace. They weren't the type to walk out unnoticed. They left their belongings behind, their cars still parked outside. And always, the last place they were seen was Theater 2. I started avoiding the late shifts, passing them off to the newer hires. But one night, when the closer called in sick, I found myself back in the booth, staring at the reels with a growing sense of dread. That's when I noticed the faces. The film reels weren't normal. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, blurs and smudges on the strips of celluloid. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't random. They were faces. Pressed into the film, stretched and distorted like they'd been burned into the material. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. I stumbled back, the reel slipping from my hands and unraveling across the floor. The whispers came again, louder now, rising in a frantic crescendo. "Let us out." I tried to quit the next day. Hargrove, the theater manager, didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigarette as he listened to my rambling explanation about ghosts and missing patrons. "I knew this job wasn't for everyone," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "But you've got a good eye for detail. You've seen more than most." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. Hargrove smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The reels aren't just film. They're a doorway. A bridge between here and somewhere else." I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was all a joke. But he didn't. "They need souls to keep the door open," he continued. "A few here, a few there. It's a small price to pay." "For what?" "To keep the stories alive," he said simply. I tried to leave that night, but the Orpheum wouldn't let me go. The doors wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled. My phone had no signal, the screen flashing no service no matter where I stood. The whispers followed me through the empty halls, growing louder, more insistent. When I reached the projection booth, the reels were already spinning, though no movie had been scheduled. On the screen, I saw myself. I was sitting in the booth, just as I was now, but I wasn't alone. Shadows crowded the tiny room, their long fingers reaching for me. I turned, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the screen, my on-screen self was screaming, clawing at the glass as the shadows consumed me. I don't know how long I've been here. The theater doesn't let you leave, not really. Sometimes, I see people walk into Theater 2, their faces lit by the glow of the screen. They never come out. If you ever find yourself at the Orpheum, don't stay for the credits. Because once the reels start spinning, they won't stop until they've taken what they need. And you might be next. Story number 6. Seat 23. Everyone in town knew about the Rialto Cinema. It was a cozy little theater tucked away on Main Street, the kind of place where popcorn was still served in red and white striped boxes and the carpets smelled faintly of mildew and nostalgia. But for all its charm, the Rialto had a reputation, a dark one. The whispers were always the same, passed from one patron to another in hushed tones. "Don't sit in seat 23. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. As a journalist trying to climb the ranks at the Beacon Tribune, I preferred hard facts to folklore. So when my editor assigned me to write a Halloween fluff piece about the so-called curse of Seat 23, I rolled my eyes and planned to churn out 500 words of harmless skepticism. But the more I dug into the story, the harder it was to dismiss. It all started in 1998, when a man named Victor Grayson died in Seat 23. The details were murky, but the police report described it as a heart attack. Witnesses said he'd been watching a late-night thriller when he suddenly clutched his chest, let out a strangled cry, and collapsed. Victor Grayson wasn't just anyone. He was a notorious killer, responsible for the deaths of at least 5 people. The police had been chasing him for years, and when they finally cornered him, he'd chosen to make his last stand in the Rialto. Some say his heart attack was karma. Others whispered that it was something more sinister, that whatever twisted force drove him to kill hadn't left when his heart stopped beating. Over the years, Seat 23 gained a reputation. People who sat there reported feeling strange, a heavy weight pressing on their chest, an icy hand brushing against their neck. A few brave souls claimed they'd seen a shadowy figure in the corner of their eye, watching them from the aisle. But the real horror came after they left the theater. The first documented incident happened in 2003. A woman named Ellen Barker sat in Seat 23 during a matinee showing of Rear Window. She was hesitant at first, joking with her friends about the curse, but by the time the credits rolled, she laughed it off. Less than 24 hours later, Ellen was dead. She fell down the stairs of her apartment building, breaking her neck. Her roommate swore she'd been acting paranoid all night, jumping at shadows and muttering about someone watching her. The stories only grew from there. A teenager sat in Seat 23 on a dare and drowned in the lake the next day. A construction worker took the seat during a packed showing and was crushed under falling scaffolding less than 12 hours later. The common thread? Every victim reported feeling a presence, an unseen watcher, before their deaths. By the time I got the assignment, Seat 23 had been roped off for years. The theater's manager, a wiry man named Gus, claimed it was for maintenance, but everyone knew the real reason. "I'm telling you, kid," Gus said when I cornered him for an interview, "there's something wrong with that seat." He was reluctant to talk at first, but a few beers loosened his tongue. "It ain't just the deaths," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's the way the room feels when someone's in that seat. The air gets heavy, like something's sitting on your chest. And the shadows, they move." "Shadows don't move," I said, trying to keep my skepticism intact. Gus just stared at me, his face pale. "They do if he's there." I decided to test the legend myself. It was a Thursday night, the theater nearly empty except for a few couples and an older man sitting up front. The film was an indie horror flick, the kind with too much blood and not enough plot. Gus looked at me like I was insane when I told him I wanted to sit in Seat 23. "Suit yourself," he muttered, handing me a ticket. "But don't say I didn't warn you." The seat was unremarkable, slightly frayed upholstery, a faint popcorn smell clinging to the fabric. But the moment I sat down, I understood what everyone meant. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, as if the weight of the entire theater was pressing down on me. My chest tightened, and a chill ran up my spine, but I forced myself to stay. The movie started, the screen flickering to life, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the shadows in the aisle, which seemed darker than they should have been. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, just loud enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around, but the aisle was empty. The couple in the row ahead of me didn't react, their eyes glued to the screen. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave." My heart pounded as I scanned the theater. The shadows in the aisle seemed to shift, pooling like liquid and stretching toward me. Then I saw him. A figure stood in the corner of the theater, barely visible in the dim light. His face was obscured, but I knew who it was. Victor Grayson. I bolted out of the seat, my breath coming in short gasps. The shadows seemed to follow me, crawling along the walls as I stumbled into the lobby. What happened? Gus asked, his eyes wide. I saw him, I said, my voice shaking. Gus didn't need me to explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the theater, his shadow stretching toward me. By morning, I knew I had to dig deeper. The police file on Victor Grayson was sparse, but one detail stood out. His final words before he died were directed at the officers who arrested him. "You'll never stop me. I'll keep hunting, even after I'm gone." That's when it clicked. Seat 23 wasn't cursed, it was a hunting ground. Victor Grayson's soul was trapped there, bound to the place of his death. And he was still killing, using the seat to lure victims into his grasp. I wrote the article, but my editor never published it. "You expect people to believe this?" he scoffed. But it didn't matter. I knew the truth, and so did Gus. The Rialto eventually closed, its doors chained shut and its marquee dark. But sometimes, when I drive past at night, I see a light flicker in the window of Theater 3. And in the darkness, I swear there's someone sitting in seat 23, waiting for the next victim. Story number 7. The Last Usher. It was a cold November night when I first stepped into the Rialto Theater. A relic of another era, its once grand facade now sagged with years of neglect. The neon marquee buzzed faintly, casting flickering shadows on the cracked pavement below. I had just been hired as the new ticket usher, a part-time gig to help make ends meet while I figured out what to do with my life. The manager, a wiry man named Mr. Halloran, gave me a quick tour of the place, the dimly lit lobby, the creaky staircases, and, of course, the massive, cavernous theaters. "This job's simple," he said, his voice echoing slightly as we stood in the empty main theater. "Take tickets, keep an eye on the crowd, and make sure no one sneaks in without paying." It sounded easy enough. But as we passed the ticket counter, I noticed a small plaque mounted on the wall. The inscription read, "In memory of John Wexler, dedicated usher and friend." "What's that about?" I asked. Mr. Halloran's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. "John was the usher before you," he said finally. "Good guy. Reliable. But, well, he disappeared about 6 months ago. Never showed up for work one day. Cops looked into it, but they didn't find anything." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Disappeared? Like, without a trace? Halloran nodded. "This place can get to you if you're not careful. Just focus on your job, and you'll be fine." For the first few nights, everything was normal. Quiet, even. The crowds were sparse, mostly older folks coming to relive their youth through black and white classics. I spent most of my shifts leaning against the ticket stand, scrolling through my phone or idly flipping through the old posters that lined the walls. But by the end of my first week, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, small things that were easy to dismiss. The faint creak of footsteps echoing in the empty lobby, the sound of a door closing when no one else was around. I chalked it up to the building's age, the kind of noises old places make when they settle. But then I started noticing the shadows. The security cameras were ancient, their grainy black and white footage barely good enough to make out shapes. I'd sit in the small office during my breaks, watching the monitors flicker between views of the lobby, the theaters, and the projection booth. One night, as I sipped my coffee, I saw it, a shadow, faint but unmistakable, moving across the lobby. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a glitch in the camera. But then it stopped, right in front of the ticket counter. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The shadow was shaped like a person, tall and broad-shouldered. It stood motionless for several seconds before vanishing into thin air. I checked the lobby. It was empty. The footsteps became more frequent after that. I'd hear them late at night, long after the last show had ended and the theater was empty. They echoed through the halls, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing just out of sight. One night, I decided to follow them. Armed with nothing but my flashlight, I crept through the darkened lobby, the beam of light slicing through the gloom. The footsteps led me to Theater 2, the largest room in the Rialto. The double doors stood ajar, and I could hear the faint hum of the projector, though no film was scheduled. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long shadows across the rows of empty seats. At first, I saw nothing unusual. But as I approached the projector booth, my breath caught in my throat. A man was standing in the aisle, his back to me. "Sir, the theater's closed," I said, trying to sound authoritative. He didn't respond. I took a cautious step closer. The man was tall, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned usher's uniform. His posture was rigid, his head tilted slightly to the side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Sir?" I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. His face was wrong, blurred and indistinct, as if I were looking at a poorly developed photograph. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce right through me. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. When I scrambled to pick it up, he was gone. The next day, I confronted Mr. Halloran. "There's something wrong with this place," I said, recounting what I'd seen. He sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice," he muttered. "Notice what?" He hesitated, then gestured for me to follow him. We went to the storage room, where he unlocked a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out an old VHS tape. "This is from the night John disappeared," he said, sliding the tape into the VCR. The footage was grainy and jittery, but it clearly showed the lobby. John Wexler, the previous usher, was standing at the ticket counter, taking tickets from a small line of patrons. But something was off. The people handing over their tickets didn't look normal. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their movements were jerky, like puppets on strings. John seemed to notice it too. He backed away from the counter, his hands raised in confusion or fear. But before he could get far, the figures swarmed him, their shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The tape ended abruptly. "They took him," Halloran said quietly. "Who?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He shook his head. "I don't know what they are. But they're tied to the tickets somehow. John must have crossed the line. Why didn't you tell me this before? Would you have taken the job if I had?" That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to end up like John. As the last show let out and the patrons filed into the lobby, I gathered every ticket stub from the counter. They felt strange in my hands, too cold, as if they'd been left in a freezer. The whispers started as I carried the tickets to the projector booth. "Join us," they said, the voices overlapping in a sinister harmony. Ignoring the growing sense of dread, I shoved the tickets into the projector and flipped the switch. The reel spun to life, and the screen flickered. Instead of a movie, it showed the lobby, but not as it was now. It was empty, abandoned, the walls crumbling and the floors covered in dust. And in the center of it all stood John Wexler, his blurred face staring out at me. He raised a hand, pointing directly at the camera. "Run," he said. The screen went dark. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I fled the Rialto that night and never went back. They say the theater closed down a few weeks later, condemned due to structural issues. But sometimes, when I pass by the boarded-up building, I can still hear the faint hum of the projector. And if I listen closely, I swear I can hear the whispers calling out for their next usher.